Thank you very much, especially Karel, for the invitation to be here today. The first thing on my paper says that I wanted to congratulate you with the launch of this Applied and Experimental Sound Research Lab, until I found out this afternoon that it doesn't exist at all, but that it's coming into existence over the next 3 years. And yeah, we are, as you have already seen and heard, we're not talking here about one lab, but 3 different labs, the sound projection lab, the field recording lab, and the mobile lab. The Dutch often think that they are ahead of the rest of the world, but in this case it is the contrary. One of the reasons that I'm very interested in what's going on here is that at Leiden University, where I'm working, I'm trying to establish a sound studies center. And the most difficult part of that is to find, for example, a physical space for sound scholars and artists to work. So in that sense, I'm looking forward to what is going on here. As Karel already said, I'm professor of auditory culture and music philosophy at Leiden University. And before that I studied political science, jazz piano, cultural studies and philosophy. And I say that because in my opinion this comes together, all these different disciplines come together in my current work, on which I will talk today. So what is this current work? Well, I'm interested in everyday sounds. And why is that? Well, let's say some 6-7 years ago, I made what I call for myself a sonic turn. That is from having a main interest in music, and especially in the role and position and function of music in our contemporary society, to sound in a more general sense. And this sonic turn, maybe I can blame or I can thank my 2 daughters for that. Because what happened is that they bring friends from school, after school, to our home to play, etc. And at a certain moment, I was in the living room playing a CD, listening to a CD. And so my daughters and their friends came in, and at a certain moment they stopped, or friends stopped, and they said, what's wrong here in the house? Is your fridge broken or something? And then my daughters answered, no, Dad is listening to a CD. And that made me think, like, okay, if they think that the music that I'm listening to resembles broken fridges, then I might as well quit listening to a CD and just listen to broken fridges. So that is what I did from that moment on, and from broken fridges I went actually to all the sounds that are surrounding us. So hence my interest in everyday sounds. What does that mean? So basically it goes in 2 directions. First, how are living beings affected by sounds? So that's the first angle, let's say. The second one is how our sonic environment is affected by the input and actions, or maybe even the non-input and non-actions of living beings. So regarding the first one, how living beings are affected by sound, I mean, you could easily think of how we react to sirens, to the signal of a microwave, to the keys of the front door, and you hear your partner or your kids or whoever else coming in. Or, of course, also think of music played in shops. Regarding the second one, so how our sonic environment is affected by living beings, we could, of course, think of deliberate interventions, think of construction works, church bells, but also silent asphalt, or more unconscious contributions, walking a street, answering phone calls, pulling a trolley case, all contribute to our sonic environment, to everyday sounds. Now, what does interest mean? I contribute to the discourse on sound studies by writing about everyday sounds, and this is a proof of it, a book that was already announced by Karel, Engaging with Everyday Sounds, published last year. But the interest goes much further and even becomes a kind of activism. I create sound walks, permanent sound installations in public space. I develop courses on sound for professionals, for children, for students, and I will also come back to that later. I'm doing quite some advisory work for governmental and non-governmental organizations. Now, going back to the question, why everyday sounds? Because besides the influence of my daughters, I was actually triggered by a quote I once read of the French writer Georges Perec. And this quote goes as follows: "What we need to question is bricks, concrete, glass, our table manners, our utensils, our tools, the way we spend our time, our rhythms. Question your teaspoons." Question your teaspoons. Well, how will you do that? Perhaps by listening to them, by exploring their affordances as sounding objects, or by somehow challenging these affordances. In any way, I was confronted here, or after having read this quote by Perec, by two almost conflicting experiences. On the one hand, I was thinking of myself as an heir of John Cage and Max Neuhaus. Why? Because I was exploring all the sounds in and around the house, abroad, while being in nature or in cities, human as well as non-human sounds. And I want to specifically mention here, I don't know if she is in the hall, but I was also intrigued by a CD by Katarina Clement, Peripheries, which she recorded during a residency in Belgrade. And through her work, I learned to listen to elevators, for example, or to a basketball court. So by listening to CDs, but actually mainly by sound walking, I got intrigued by the beauty of so many sounds that together form our daily sonic environment. However, on the other hand, and this was a simultaneous experience, the sonic design of especially public urban spaces is almost non-existent. It's not part of the work of architects, of urban planners, of policymakers. On a daily basis, we are often exposed to too many, too loud sounds, or for that matter also to inaudible sounds of electromagnetic fields. Hardly anyone cares about the sonic composition of a space. Hardly anyone has clear ideas about a sonic atmosphere. Hardly anyone cares how this daily exposure to all these sounds affects our mood, our well-being, our health, but also social interaction, ecology, feeling of safety, etc. So it is my claim that we have an ethical imperative to listen critically to the world around us. And why is that so? Well, for example, to resist the idea that our sonic environment is simply present, an often uninspiring, neutral or too noisy background. So learning to listen to everyday sounds is a step towards social, political, and ecological responsibility. And this listening makes also a critical evaluation possible. Should we protect certain parts of our sonic environment, or should we develop alternatives? So, let's go a bit more into detail about listening critically to everyday sounds. And the first thing I would like to mention here is that I was immediately confronted with a trap, with a dilemma. Everyday sounds normally occur on the periphery of perception. Their power lies exactly in remaining mostly unnoticed. So by deliberately paying attention to them, this sonic familiarity slips away. So that was a dilemma I was facing. How to deal with everyday sounds, how to listen to those sounds without transforming the ordinary experience. What I mean by this is this. Shopping, pile driving, riding a bike became a music or sonic activity for me. Going to a market, taking a shower, preparing breakfast was like attending a concert. And recording them meant separating these sounds from their normal context. So bringing these sounds to my attention automatically meant to not neglect them. So I did everyday them, transform them. The second thing I would like to mention beside this dilemma or this trap is that something else occurred when dealing with everyday sounds. Namely, the experience that the everyday encompasses both ordinary and extraordinary sounds, both known and unknown sounds. And here I could refer briefly to another French thinker, Michel de Certeau, who talks about everyday practices as being always permeated by a certain resistance. By using and by experiencing these everyday practices differently also implies, so differently because you change these relationships to everyday practices every time you encounter them. And that also implies, according to de Certeau, a critical response to the imposed order and system of these same everyday practices. So he concludes that a full colonization of the daily is, in fact, impossible. And in that sense, he says, the everyday is always also extraordinary, special, unique. Now, is it possible to avoid the trap of listening with care to our sonic environment, thereby acknowledging the thereby acknowledging the existence of things with whom we coexist, without defamiliarizing this environment? In other words, is a reconciliation possible between listening to the ordinary and to the extraordinary? Can listening be simultaneous, attentive, respectful, and careful, and, on the other hand, distracted, practical, and mundane? I coin in this book the concept listening traveling, which in fact is nothing more than how we mostly listen. Namely, sometimes we follow a sound, sometimes we return to what could be heard before. Sometimes we lose ourselves in sonic worlds, sometimes we anticipate what will be heard. Sometimes we perceive the source, sometimes we register things or events hidden from view. So, listening traveling oscillates between careful perception, recognition, imagination, memories, associations, etc. It oscillates between attention and distraction. Experiencing how, why, where we are affected by them is listening at the edge of conscious attention. In All Art is Ecological, Timothy Morton calls this a playful carefulness. That is, a care for humans and non-humans that is nothing more or less than simply allowing them to exist. And if we transport that idea to sounds in particular, then we come very close to John Cage's proposal of letting sounds be. Now, instead of remaining with Morton's position here, I would like to suggest to go just a little bit further. The aim of this book, which is actually not a book, it's an EPUB, so it's very hard to buy a hard copy, but it's for free when you just download it from the internet. The aim of this EPUB is to develop a resensitization of the acoustic environment while remaining as much as possible in a quotidian situation. Therefore, I talk about this switch between diverse listening regimes, what I call this listening traveling. And the effect of this resensitization might range from appreciation to rejection, from protection to sonic interventions. So in that sense, it is more, especially when I'm talking about sonic interventions, it is more than Timothy Morton's playful care or Cage's letting everyday sounds be. Because, I mean, it's simply possible also that on the basis of your everyday listening, you decide that things should change in your sonic environment. Now, for these sonic interventions, I use the term, which is hard to say, but it's non-art, but then the non is between brackets. So, although it can be appreciated aesthetically, these sonic interventions need not be artistic in the institutional sense. The interventions or the intentions to intervene can be pragmatically rather than artistically driven. For example, to mask or reduce unpleasant sounds, or to create more sonic diversity, or to increase a general well-being, or to stimulate social interaction, or to contribute to a safer environment, or to prevent heat stress or flooding, or to stimulate biodiversity. Better said, maybe, the aesthetic and the practical can be regarded as almost complementary, integrated. In any sense, the results of those sonic interventions concentrate more on experiences and concrete actions than in calling a specific intervention art or not. It's for me not really an issue. And here, in this non-art or artistic interventions, I see a new and extra role for sound artists, composers, musicians, and artistic researchers. What can these roles be? Well, the first one is extremely simple one. Sound artists, composers, musicians, artistic researchers, they can teach us to listen. Or not only to listen, but sometimes also to de-listen or to re-listen. To listen beyond habitual ways, to listen differently, altering the relationship to everyday sounds. They can also teach us to somehow hear that annoying sounds may reveal interesting layers, although of course the reverse is also possible. They increase the auditory imagination, oscillating between what is and what can be. How can they do that? Well, for example, by organizing or developing sound walks, by making recordings, by acknowledging that sounds are there, part of our everyday lives. And both sound walks and recordings make possible a performative listening, guided by curiosity, by care, by responsiveness, and humility. However, they can also teach us that the world, the work, listening carefully, is not the privileged world of the sound artist or the engineer, the professional or the expert. Resensitization means that the one who inhabits this everyday world can be the expert, can be the non-artist or the artist. For these other roles that the sound artists, musicians, composers, artistic researchers can take on, I need to talk not from my position as a sound scholar or professor of auditory culture, but from my position as a consultant. And my work mainly concentrates on advising governmental and non-governmental organizations on the sonic redesign of public urban spaces. And often, I mean, when I'm asked to give these kind of consultancies or advisory advices, of course, they always start that people are complaining about noise in certain parts of a city. And traditionally, there are developed and have been developed and are still developing all kind of models and measurements. And these measurements usually are decibel measurements. And on the basis of these models that are developed and these measurements that are being done, there are basically two possibilities. First, yes, they agree. The models and measurements confirm the complaints of the residents, namely that there is too much noise. So, solution is decibel reduction. The problem, however, is how. How can you, in a very simple and effective way, reduce the decibel level in a rather big city in the Netherlands or wherever in the world? The other option is that on the basis of the models and the measurements, they come to the conclusion that there is no problem, because simply the decibels are under the norm. So there's no action needed. So here we are, residents, sorry, but it is not loud enough, so we won't do anything. My approach is a little bit different. First, by not talking so much about noise, but talking about sound instead, which is already like a fundamental difference in the discourse which is used by acousticians, for example. To talk about sound as an intrinsic element of our environment. And to start from the question, which is of course not a very easy question, how to create a positive sonic ambience, which has nothing to do, well, not necessarily to do with decibel reduction. I mean, it can be, but not necessarily so. But there are other options. And I want to give you three very brief examples of the ways that me and team with whom I'm working can provide alternatives. The first one is a permanent sound installation called Whispering Wind, which is made in an underpass, kind of tunnel, which connects the city center of Leiden to the botanical gardens. And actually what it does, it is adding sounds to the sonic environment. So instead of decibel reductions, it's adding decibels. Thereby turning, in our opinion, insignificant space into a more or less special experience, challenging the existing soundscape, while simultaneously connecting with the already existing sounds that are happening outside of this tunnel. So in that sense, it is oscillating or playing a game between familiarity and unusualness. The second example is about a fountain in the middle of my hometown, Rotterdam. This fountain, which is actually surrounded by a roundabout with quite a lot of traffic, this fountain basically can be turned off or on. And when it's off, then you hear the sounds of the traffic. And when it's on, then you hear white noise, which indeed resembles the sound of traffic. So our idea is, or my idea is, the Conservatoire of Rotterdam is just around the corner. So I went there to the composition department and I asked if some students would be interested in making a sound piece for this fountain, only using the water, only using the nozzles, this where the water comes out, but in such a way that you create a more heterogeneous soundscape. So instead of having only the possibility that it's turned on or off, we now try to work, and which is more like a technical work, at least in the beginning, to let all the nozzles work independently from one another, so that we can make like, okay, sometimes you hear it on the right, sometimes it's on the back, sometimes it's on the left, sometimes all together, sometimes it's only one nozzle playing, etc., etc. You can imagine what the possibilities are. So again, thereby creating a more heterogeneous soundscape. The third example is they are planning, also in Rotterdam, they're planning a park which is quite near to the city center, but perhaps more important, it should be a kind of ecological park, and it is also like we have the River Danube here in Rotterdam, we have the Maas, so it's next to the Maas. And when you walk there in this, what will in the near future be a park, you hear, there are already trees and plants, etc., some animals, but you hear next to the natural sounds, you hear the city sounds. And, but what you don't hear is the river. And somehow the project leaders had the idea, so how can we integrate the river in the experience of people walking there in the future? So our idea was to establish some kind of, at certain parts, a booth where you can listen to the underwater sounds. So with hydrophones, we give them the opportunity, people are walking there, to listen to the sounds underwater, which there are not many fish anymore there, but you can hear the boats, etc. In other words, next to the first example, adding sounds, the second example, making a soundscape more heterogeneous, this is an example of revealing usually inaudible sounds. So thereby creating a more interesting sonic environment. I round off. Discussions about beauty are always problematic, especially perhaps in public environments. However, what artists can do, or at least propose, is not only to make an environment aesthetically more appealing, but by exploring and disclosing unforeseen and unexpected sonic possibilities of a certain site, they thereby make it possible for people to be affected in different ways. To be affected and to affect. That is, to interact in different ways with the environment, with all the human and non-human agents that together give shape to that environment. To interact in different ways, even with themselves. So, to increase the possibility of affecting and being affected. In my opinion, that is the important role of the practical and theoretical work by sound artists, artistic researchers, composers, musicians, etc. And it is here that art and research intersect. It is here that aesthetics and ethics intersect. And all this may start, as Georges Perec implicitly suggested, by listening to teaspoons. Thank you.
How is your experience with the context, as we are University of Applied Arts with a lot of architecture interest, in collaborating with architects, like working directly in those environments, so to say?
Yeah, it's a very good and a very difficult question. To talk from my own experience, I have several things to say. First of all, when it's about redesigning a public urban environment, our experience is that architects are granted approximately like three years to come up with a decent plan, and then some residents start complaining. So the policymakers get nervous, and then they think, oh yeah, maybe we should do something about sound as well. So then they call me, and then you get 3 months to come up with a decent sound plan. So whereas the architects get 3 years, we get 3 months. And of course the plan is already there, which means that you cannot do too much, because otherwise the architect gets mad at you. What I learned from architects is if you see the plan that they make, so you get this brochure, and of course it looks fantastic. This, when it's about, okay, there should be more green in the city, then of course you only see full-grown trees. Whereas, I mean, I don't know how it is here, but in Holland we start with trees that are like approximately 1.5 meters, so it takes about, let's say, a couple of generations before the trees are full grown, if they haven't died before because of the air pollution. The sun is always shining. Happy families, basically white families. And although it is a city center, there's no tram inside, no car, etc., etc. Now what I learned is, okay, if they can make this kind of artist impression, I can make a sonic artist impression. So what is included in all my reports is, first of all, like, okay, the current situation, so I make recordings there, but you know, okay, I do something with them so that you get all the traffic noise at once. So it's enormous blast of noise. And then I say, okay, and now if you do everything that we propose, then it will sound this. Well, I mean, of course it will not, I'm not that kind of an idiot that I make then, like you're in the middle of a forest, but you hear a tram every now and then, you hear a car every now and then, but you hear buskers, street musicians, you hear birds also singing, you hear the water. So I make an art impression, a sonic art impression. And then the negotiations start, not only with the architect, but also with the policymakers. as I said, one of the things that I'm trying to do is to make courses for professionals. So also to educate architects, because at least in the Netherlands, I mean, you get the basic acoustics and you know the law. So what are the confines within which you have to work? But to think like creatively about what a sonic environment can do and what it can contribute, of course no attention there. So we are also making classes for these people in order to re-educate them a little bit. But of course the most remarkable thing is that when you think of an urban environment, then immediately you think only of the visuals. You never think about sound. So I feel like a Don Quixote most of the times, like, hey guys, there is also an auditory experience, and it's so important. I mean, all the complaints, all the problems that the main problem, or one of the main problems of city life is noise, is about noise, complaints coming from people. So in that sense, I think it deserves more and more attention than what it gets now. But it's a hard struggle.
Is it fine? Yeah. So my question is, in the architecture sphere, now more and more, at least where I come from, they are trying to involve also like the regular population, and specifically the people that live into a specific area, also into the design of how the places will be changed. So I was wondering if you work also with like the general population, and if you could explain maybe or deepen a little bit more how you do it and which kind of process it is and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, as I also said in my presentation, it is not that the sound artist, musician, and nor the architect or the urban planners are the experts. It is the one who is using this space or living in that space who is the expert. So our methodology is very much to organize sound walks with residents, as well as with the architects and with urban planners and with the policymakers and others who are responsible there. Preferably with all of them together. I mean, like that we have representatives of each group. So, but next to these sound walks, we have of course, our questionnaires, but we also organize workshops where all these groups meet each other. Because usually, although it's we talk a lot in the Netherlands about participation of citizens, in effect it comes down to, okay, here's the plan and you can change a comma or a period, but that's about it, because this is already decided. When in these workshops that we organize, you can see that, I mean, for the first time people are really talking to one another. And there you have to pay attention that, on the one hand, that you take the emotions of the residents serious and of the users. On the other hand, that, of course, it is not only about the emotion, so you have to also to get rid of that layer a little bit in order to come to a kind of fruitful discussion. Just to give one very brief example, at this moment I'm working or doing a project for the Ministry of Defense, which is in itself very problematic, I must say, but they're having a radar system in a very remote town in the northern part of the Netherlands. And just to illustrate the classical way of thinking, so before I did that work, before I started the work, I got many reports by academic organizations who did some measurements there, who made models there. And they all say that Ministry of Defense, they don't have to change anything about the radar because it is far below the decibel level that is set as a kind of standard, so you should not come above that one. So we have all these reports. And then I drove there and I simply started listening. And it was very hard in the beginning to hear the sound of the radar, because it was covered by all kind of other sounds there. It is very rural environment, so lots of farmers, and it was harvest time, so there was quite some noise there. So I thought, what are these residents complaining about? Actually, you don't even hear it. But at a certain moment, you could tune in to the sound because it was a really pitched sound. And once you had that sound in your head, you couldn't get rid of it anymore. And that was exactly what was happening with these residents. So when I drove home after a couple of days, this pitch stayed with me for a couple of days. I could immediately sing exactly the pitch of that radar. And it was then that I understood what these residents actually experience every day. And it convinced me in the idea that all these acousticians with all their reports on measurements and models, that they were not right, that they didn't take the complaints of these people serious, because the problem is somewhere else. I would even say the problem is not only in the sound, but there are other problems underneath. For example, that and that is when you talk to these people, and why it's so important to have the discussion with the residents. They thought, we cannot sell our house anymore because who wants to live here? So underneath this idea of sound, there was also economic, like dissatisfaction. It was about not having been taken serious by the authorities, because they were never respected when they said, yeah, but we complain, we really suffer from this sound. So there were many other things that are part of this of the sound problem. So in that sense, that's why I was also emphasizing the idea that when we talk about sound, we talk about ecology, economy, about interaction, about politics. So who owns a certain space, who is responsible for a certain space. I think these should all be taken into consideration. So it's not always an issue that can be solved by acousticians of sound engineers. Well, it was a very long answer, and I hopefully covered some of what you were asking.
Thank you. I'll follow right up. Thanks for your talk, Marcel. Thanks for pointing out that there's so much else but decibel and frequencies below discussing what constitutes noise in public space. I wonder, in your project of advising, and now I'm giving a long question, when we speak about what noise is, we also have to speak about property and about who owns the airwaves and who gets to decide what noise is. In the history of noise as an ideology, often bourgeois ruling classes have decided what is silent and what is loud. And thinking about Vienna, for instance, I mean, often it's poor people which are deemed that they're too loud, or racialized people that they're too loud. So how do you deal with this problem in your advice?
Yeah, you're very right about that. The whole idea of trying to create a silent environment is actually a white bourgeois and upper class ideal, which is certainly not supported by everyone. And of course that doesn't make the work a lot easier. There's one example that I would like to mention. In the first issue of the journal that I'm running, the Journal of Sonic Studies, there was a contribution of Jacqueline Waldock doing research into the one of the suburbs of Liverpool, which were teared down because, I mean, it were old houses, so lots of problems there. It's actually the area where Ringo Starr is born, and that's the only house that remains. So the house where Ringo Starr is born, the rest is all destroyed. And so they had to convince, of course, the residents that they should move to another place. Yeah, but it's much better there. It's warm. It's insulated, and double glass, etc. And and less noise. And these people, when they moved, they were very unhappy because they said, but I always could hear when the neighbor came home, and I knew then, like what time it was, what time of the day it was, or what day of the week it was, etc. So it was part of their social environment and of their social engagement with the others. So it was in fact a failure that they moved them to houses which were, in this bourgeois ideal, so much better than where they came from. So it is something that we have to take into consideration. On the other hand, and that's why I also came about presented the idea of making a more heterogeneous environment. It shouldn't exclude us from the idea that I think that many cities, at least in the northern part of Europe, sound quite homogeneous. So it doesn't matter so much where you are. It's always, I mean, what you hear is basically traffic sounds. And I think that also that is something that architects should think of, is that that we should build in different ways, and so to make it possible at least to enter a different soundscape every, let's say, 50 or 100 or 150 meters, which means that sometimes it is indeed, it is loud, it's noisy, it's you could also say bristling or like lively, and in other places, so when you go into a side street, that you come into a quiet place. So I think this heterogeneity of an urban environment, I think that is where, for me, the key is. I would like to add one more thing, and that is because now so for me it's of utmost importance, and I do that with every project that I'm doing. There are always sound artists involved. So that is, if they ask me to give some advice, and I say yes, I have a team of people, and at least one of those people is a sound artist. So and that is, I mean, as I said, because I think first of all that they are very good listeners, and also, I mean, I hope that I can, and usually it works that way, that I can benefit from their idea of thinking, listening differently. So not like only thinking of the most, or not only thinking about solutions, but thinking more about possibilities. So what is this space offering to us? As I said in my talk, what it is important, but what it can be is perhaps even more important. And so for me, adding these people who are educated in such a way to the team is for me of crucial importance. And somehow the people with whom I'm working or who ask me to do this advisory work, they buy it. So they accept that that sound artists are involved, and I think that is, and that was also the idea that I think that the role of people doing creative education can be much more than what they sometimes think that it can be. When I asked these composers to make a composition for a fountain, only using the water sounds, for them it was like, hey, but yeah, I'm working on a string quartet right now. I think, okay, but who will ever listen to that string quartet? So is there also, can you think beyond these confines of working as a composer? Can you exceed, can you also go beyond that idea and maybe do also something else which is maybe not your comfort zone so much? So in that sense, I'm also trying to make the artist move a little bit.
In your talk before, you also posed a question whether we should protect certain sonic environments. And did I get that right, that you meant like we protect historical buildings, for example? And if so, like what examples could you give for that?
Well, yeah, I'm not thinking so much of whole building. I mean, when I'm thinking about protecting, then it means like protecting certain sounds, for example. So that can be the sound of a, I mean, there's a particular squeaking sound of the trams in Rotterdam. And I think it's worth to keep that sound. And also we have a particular Rotterdam sound of the signals of the trams. And so that belongs to a city. It makes a city sonically. So in that sense, although maybe it is loud and sometimes annoying, on the one hand, it's also like belonging to the cultural heritage of a city. And this morning we were talking about material and non-material culture. So I think that we pay not enough attention to our non-material cultural heritage. Yes, in Holland we keep then a bell in a museum and they say, yeah, and that made that sound. Yeah, the bell made that sound, but can I listen to the sound? No, you're not allowed to touch it. So in that sense, I think we should take into consideration also when redesigning a public environment, what sounds are already there and which sounds are worth to be kept there. It doesn't have to be like historically valuable necessarily, but it can also like, okay, when you, for example, put different trees there, then certain birds will disappear because they don't feel attracted to that tree, to those type of trees. So it can take many different forms. And so one of the things, as I was explaining, one of the possibilities is like being aware again of the water. So by listening to these underwater sounds, but you become actually aware that Rotterdam or Vienna or so many other cities is, I mean, in the middle of the city there's this river, and Rotterdam made this stupid decision once after the Second World War to turn its back to the river, and now slowly we are opening up towards the river again. So making people aware that this river is sounding also, it gives another attitude towards the river and towards the city.
Thank you very much for the talk. You got me particularly interested in the example of the fountain in Rotterdam. And you said it's white noise if it's turned on, and if it's not turned on, there's white noise of the traffic. So controlling each of the outlets separately, that's what you did. you can control the spatial sound field. Do you have any chance to also control the timbre, to change the timbre? Can you maybe even change or modify the outlets, something like that?
Well, first I have to say that this is not realized yet. So this is a plan that we made, but it is accepted. So they will do it, but first some other works need to be done before we can realize this. We are concentrating on the nozzles only. But of course it doesn't mean that the timbre will not change, although we are not in control of it. But depending on the wind, for example, or the amount of traffic, or how close you are to this fountain. I mean, there are many other parameters that could be mentioned. So whether it's in summer or winter, so if the trees have leaves or not. I mean, there are so many other parameters which make that this timbre will change according to where you as a listener are positioned. And depending on, I mean, temperature, everything has its influence, or whether it's raining or not. So how that influence, so it's never an isolated thing. So in that sense, controlling not, but that it will sound differently each time you will come there, for sure. And I think that is actually enough.
You talked at the beginning in a very interesting way about your evolving own relationship with sound, so via your daughter's friends and your fridge. You didn't say much about time. So, like, sound is audible time, or sound is time as experienced by your ears, and all your active listening is paid for in time. So I'm wondering whether your relationship with time has evolved as well. Do you feel differently about that since this journey you've been on?
You're absolutely right that I'm more interested or more focused on space than on time. But of course, first of all, when listening to whether it's music or if it's a washing machine or whatever else, means that you are spending time with it. And in order to, like what I said, having a responsibility, so the ability to respond to these sounds or to let them, to take care of them in the sense of letting them enter you, your body, your mind, your imagination, your associations, your memories, whatever it is that they trigger. That costs time. So my daughters, they think that I'm completely mad if I'm sitting for 1.5 hours in front of the washing machine and simply listening to that. Well, the cat is sitting next to me because she's interested in all these movements and the water, etc. So I'm not completely on my own. But they think after 10 seconds, well, I mean, it sounds all the same. And then I say, no, because listen, so when this program evolves, then of course it makes many different sounds. And they say, oh, Dad, come on, it's boring. I said, no, but yeah, I mean, yeah, it takes time in that sense before you. So, but it also takes in that sense an effort to do, and yeah, it's time consuming to listen in general. Yeah.
I just reminded on the situations when you sit in the plane and suddenly the sound changes. That's also very interesting.
Something that stuck with me is that I don't remember what you said exactly, but in the beginning you were talking in a few sentences about living beings. And I was thinking that, well, that's nice, because I hope to see like a more than human perspective reflected in the talk. But then it was more human-centric, I would say. And then afterwards, I kind of had the feeling that all the sounds that we make as humans are perceived as noises, or like when people complain, it's about human noises or human-made sounds, let's say, and less about the natural sounds, which are always or often talked about as something positive. So if we want to make a soundscape better, we put some trees or birds or stuff like this. So I had this feeling that like the more than human is used to kind of cure something that we mess up somehow. And I wanted to ask you what is the perspective, or if there is a perspective or a thought about also like the non-human and how that relates to sound and how that is taken into consideration where we plan something on the sonic perspective.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I agree with you that when I started talking about the consultancy work that I'm doing, that actually the human perspective prevails and becomes the most important. So it is the residents that are complaining, it is on the human scale that you do or propose some kind of interventions. So in that sense, you're absolutely right. Although just one thing that you said, when there's complaints about sounds, yes, it's sounds produced by humans often, but not human sounds, not in the sense like humans making those sounds, but it's more about the sounds of machines or of traffic or construction works. So it is that type of sound which raises the most complaints. Although if you look at the majority of the complaints are coming basically from sounds made by neighbors, which can be loud music, for example, or screaming, but also can also be human sounds. But basically, there are not sounds directly produced by humans. Nevertheless, we pay quite some attention to ecological issues. So when I was talking about how sonic interventions can also can simultaneously contribute to, let's say, for example, more biodiversity, or by changing the design. For just one example. There's in another city in the Netherlands, Utrecht, they're planning a new suburb, and our idea is to make that suburb car-free, which means that the streets can be perhaps a bit narrower, so people don't park their car in front of their house, which is very regular and very much wanted, still wanted in the Netherlands. But that this street can be occupied again by playing kids, but also by other living beings, like trees, plants, animals. But also that, of course, it's also there close to a canal, so the idea is also to have running water through these streets. which can also help against heat stress, and it can also act as a reservoir for water when it's raining, like it was raining the last 3 weeks in the Netherlands, pouring with rain. So in that sense, I hope that we also take into consideration, although humans benefit from it, it's not only the humans that are benefiting from it. So I hope that our ideas about starting to think from changing the sonic environment can also help to expand the biodiversity and to give more space to other than human living beings.
Did you have the question?
Thank you. I want to follow up to this question about time and space, and just mention that, of course, you cannot separate those things. There is always both. And I think Salome Voegelin was the one who coined the term of space-time. And so, number one. And number two, there are also different notions of what we consider time. Christoph Cox brought in this terminology of flux, sonic flux, as opposed to composed time. So when you're sitting in front of the washing machine, I would say that's a quite traditional setting of a concert situation, as opposed to sound art, listening to the environment, being in this everyday situation of sonic flux that has no beginning and no end. And the third point I would like to make is, why couldn't white noise be thought of as a landmark as well? Isn't it all about aesthetic decisions? Isn't it all about aestheticization? And in the end, political power to say this is good and this is bad and this is what we want?
Where to start here? Maybe with the last thing. When I was raising this idea of white noise, or let's say, not so much. I mean, it is not about white noise so much. It was about that there was not much of a difference between the fountain being on or off. And so what we proposed is like, okay, can we create more diversity in this sonic environment? And that is, and for that we made a proposal, not so much whether it is white noise or not, because indeed, I mean, we can also enjoy white noise or whatever noise for that matter. It was more like to create or to make people aware that a particular sounding environment can sound differently from what it is now, for example, and that it is not like a kind of supplement which comes next to or which is actually the effect of certain other interventions that have taken place there. So it is like making people aware that you can have an influence on how a particular environment sounds by doing certain interventions so that it sounds differently. And whether that is, I mean, I could also think, okay, maybe we could create more white noise at a certain part of a city or wherever else. That could also be a possibility, but it's about opening up the idea of that it is possible to design a sonic environment to a certain extent, at least. What was your last question again? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. Yeah. You said like spending time in front of a washing machine is like attending a concert. Yeah, in a way that is so. But I would reverse it. Actually, that was my claim, my implicit claim, that when I'm attending a concert, I'm not there with the sound all the time. So I'm listening back and forwards, for example. So at certain moments something is happening, and that keeps resonating in my mind or ear. So I'm losing a bit track of other things that are going on, and that is not only with sound art installations, where you can indeed decide how long you will listen to it, and when you enter and the thing is already going on. I mean, this is with all concerts. So this attention span is relatively short. And then you go in different ways. I mean, at least that is my experience of listening to whatever. So you are there with the sound, and you pay attention. Is there some kind of tonality or not, and is there some structure in the development of the composition? Yes, that is one way of listening to it, which occurs, which happens. But there are so many other listening regimes taking place when you are either at a concert, or sitting in front of the washing machine, or in an airplane, or being here in a space. I mean, I'm pretty sure that none of you have heard every sentence, consciously that I've spoken. So, I mean, you hear something, and then you drift away because you're triggered by it, or you think it's quite boring, or you know already what I'm talking about. So. And then you think, oh yeah, I have to go to the grocery store, or yeah, my wife is waiting for me now with dinner, so I should hurry up, or I'm thirsty. So, and that is also how we attend a concert, and how we listen. And actually, this idea of listening, this multiple listening attitudes that we have, that is what I'm interested in, and what I want to keep, and that is. That was my idea of trying to avoid a trap of turning everyday sounds into music, for example, because that is not what I have in mind.
Okay, thanks, Marcel, for now it's the left side having a question. Thanks for the interesting talk, and I'm interested to know what kinds of institutions approach you. You already talked about the Ministry of Defense, and I think some, the City Council or something. So which kinds of institutions approach you? And also, that's linked to it, have you also sometimes proactively suggested to intervene in some sonic environment, or if you haven't with some institution, is there a place that you would consider interesting to sonically intervene in?
Yeah, the sound installation that I was talking about, this in this underpass, Whispering Wind, that was not a commission. Or let's say that was our own initiative, because they were rebuilding this building, and we thought, okay, this is the ideal moment of doing something there. There were already ideas of course not sonically, but visually, how can we design this underpass, and then we came with the idea of making a sound installation there, and that also affected how the whole tunnel looks, because what you see on one side is a panel, is a kind of sonogram, which is for most people not recognizable. But anyway, it looks very different from what these people actually had in mind. So that was like more proactive. As I said already, Ministry of Defense and city governments of Rotterdam, Utrecht, The Hague, they are approaching me, but also there's, for example, the Dutch Organization of Autism, who are making new housings for people who really have to be there all the time, who can't live with their family anymore, because it's, I mean, their type of autism is such that they need to be in a separate environment. So also for them, I'm doing some advisory work. And also very famous in the Netherlands is Tata Steel, which is a huge complex of steel production. Lots of air pollution, but also noise pollution. And the residents there, they approach me whether I can come up with ideas to somehow improve their environment, which I always have to tell them that, of course, I'm not a wizard. It's not like, okay, you call Cobussen and wow, then we will live in a beautiful environment. The most we can do is to come up with some recommendation, but also, no, let me put it in another way. I think also a sonic environment cannot be completely designed, because that would have this modernist idea that we can control everything that we do. And I mean, there are enough examples that there are so many things out of our control. So in that sense, it's not my idea that okay, and then we do these interventions and then problems are solved. And in that sense, I'm doing recommendations, but simultaneously I'm also asking, when I'm doing these sound walks with residents, for example, I mean, I'm not implicitly asking them, but it often happens that they change their attitude towards the sounds that they are hearing. Sounds that are a priori rejected sometimes are, when you start listening to them, then you really listening to them, you think, but actually they're not that bad, or they belong to this environment, or yeah, there is some quality here, or they give me like a familiar feeling or a safe feeling, or yeah, I feel at ease here. And these are sometimes sounds that are produced by humans or by machines. So as soon as, and indeed, when you ask people, so what would you change? Then they say, yeah, it should be quiet, and there should be more water sounds and more bird sounds. Of course, I mean, you know that those will be the answers. But when you start doing these listening exercises with people, then it's quite often and quite quickly actually the idea changed that actually it should be more than that, because they also think, oh yeah, okay, I've heard these rustling leaves now, that's also quite boring actually, so let's have a plane every now and then, because that makes it more interesting. So there's also, it's not only about sonic interventions and doing what the residents ask you to do, but also educate the residents in that sense a little bit.